Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our weekly shir. A warm welcome to all those who are joining us here in person, as well as all of those who are with us online as well. Thank you to everybody for being here. So as we know, we are already excitedly coming closer to Chag HaPurim, to the celebration of Purim as we do every year. And it's important at these times and these junctures of the year to try to talk Me'inyana Diyoma. So this morning we're going to talk about a topic that is related to the Purim season, something that I personally have thought about for quite some time. It's one of the mitzvahs HaTorah that I dare say is extremely hard for us to appreciate in today's society and today's culture in which we live. And by that, I refer to our annual minhag of reading Parshas Zachor. And I'm not going to get into all the halacha about reading Parshas Zachor and are men obligated and women obligated and from a sacred Torah and with it tzibur. And what do we do during a pandemic when not everybody's able to come to shul? There are plenty of other places you can look to find the answers to those questions, but I'd like to discuss today some very important takeaway messages in Hashkafa that at least I can say I have struggled with. I think are important values to think about as we read Parshas Zachor. So we know that this is an age-old practice to read Parshas Zachor once a year, and this is something that is done the Shabbos before Purim. And the reason why we read this before Purim is because, as we know, Haman is one of the infamous characters of the Purim story. Haman goes down in history for all eternity as Haman Ha'agagi. Haman Ha'agagi means he is Haman who comes, who's a descendant, who's a product of Agag. Now, who was Agag? Agag was a general of the army of the Amalekim. Agag was the infamous personality who, in the days of Shaul Amalek, when he was given the instruction to destroy, to eradicate Amalek from the world, he leaves Agag alive. And the Gemara has an assumption that Haman is an offshoot. Haman is an appendage from Agag, and he is from the same old cloth, and he is the same problem that Agag was. And therefore, we assume that this is an appropriate read for our coming closer to the holiday of Purim. So what exactly is it that the Torah instructs us to do? So we look at the Psukim just to orient ourselves and to understand the context of what it is that we remind ourselves of. So we look at the Psukim very quickly. Zachor es asher salacha Amalek b'derech b'tzeischa miMitzrayim. These are Psukim in Parshas Kiseitze, where we are all instructed. Zachor means we need to remember. And the Gemara says it's not enough to remember in our minds. Zafira also means bipeh. We need to articulate our thoughts and feelings about this issue. And what is it that we're supposed to remember? That on our way out of Mitzrayim, Asher Parchav Aderech, that they happened upon us, that they stumbled upon the Jewish people, and they made all kinds of problems. That this was at a time when we, as a nation, were very vulnerable. And we were worn out. We were traveling in the desert. We were completely lost. We had no direction at all. And in comes Amalek. And therefore, the Torah says that after all this settled down, HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructs us, Timchez Zecher Amalek Tachas HaShamayim. We have an obligation to exterminate, to eradicate, to abolish, to uproot entirely the remembrance or the mention of Amalek. And that is something that we do once a year in the Shabbos that immediately precedes the holiday of Purim. The Rambam, when he describes this mitzvah, adds not only the instruction that we have for doing the mitzvah, but also the Rambam adds the mindset that we should have when doing so as well. And you look at this Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvot, where he tells us, Hu shetzivanu lizkar ma she'asa lanu Amalek. We have an obligation to remember what it is that Amalek did. V'hakdimo lahara lanu, that Amalek initiated an offense, that Amalek was aggressive in their intrusion against the Jewish people. And as a result of that, says the Rambam, we have an obligation to which is shocking. The Rambam says not only to destroy them, but the Rambam says to have a venomous hatred, a sense of hostility, of animosity toward Amalek. in all generations, b'chol eitz ve'etz. And then the Rambam says, as if that was not enough, v'nizares ha'am l'sno oso. We encourage and we inspire our people to absolutely hate all that Amalek represents. Ad shelo tishachach hamitzvah, make sure that this mitzvah is never forgotten. V'lo techalesh shinaso, and never should we diminish or subside our feelings of hatred. Never should they wane in any generation, at any time, wherever we may be in the world. Very strong words of the Rambam, which he does not say when he describes the mitzvah of keeping Shabbos, nor does he say when he describes the mitzvah of tefillin or kashrus or anything else that we all observe every day of our lives. Yet the Rambam here goes so far out of his general context, and he gives us not only the instruction for the mitzvah, but he tells us don't ever forget and always make sure that you remind yourself of that absolute hatred and that vile animosity that we need to have toward Amalek. There's a fascinating halachic discussion that actually went on for about 400 years. It's just fascinating whenever you talk about a halacha that was discussed in the last couple of hundred years, and sometimes one of the great gedolim from 400 years ago said something, which led somebody 100 or 200 years later to say something else, which then elicits a response 300 or 400 years later. So it's just fascinating to watch the development of halacha. So the Mahari Isserlin, one of the great Chachmei Ashkenaz in the early 1400s, and the Mahari Isserlin in his Sefer Tumas Hadeshen discusses something which I think for most of us is probably not so relevant, but in the days of poor and small Jewish communities, this was a very relevant question. And the Mahari Isserlin wants to know, if I have an option to go to shul, either for Parshas Zachor, which is before Purim, or to go to shul on Purim itself and hear the Megillah, which one should I choose? Now, most of us don't have to make these choices. We can go to shul for Parshas Zachor, and we can go to shul to hear the Megillah, and it doesn't normally seem to be a problem. It's not normally a conflict, but there unfortunately are many who are not well enough to go out twice within 1 week, or live in a community where there is no opportunity to have both of these experiences, and they have to travel out of town. And the question is, should they go for Parshas Zachor, or should they go for Mikra Megillah? Now, as we know, Mikra Megillah, that is the highlight of Purim. How can you miss Megillah? What would Purim be without that? And yet, the Mahari Isserlin, the Sefer Tumas Hadeshen, assumes that if one is faced with this dilemma, with this choice that has to be made, you should choose to read Parshas Zachor instead of Mikra Megillah. So we should overlook the entire centerpiece of Purim, overlook the Megillah, because Parshas Zachor is even more important. So there's a technical glitch in that, because the Magen Avraham, who when we say is a machlokes, the Magen Avraham and Tumas Hadeshen, they didn't believe at the same time at all. Tumas Hadeshen was in the 1400s. Magen Avraham was in the 1600s, and he says, well, I'm not quite sure why it's even a dilemma. After all, if you've ever been to shul on Purim morning, you will know that we read from the Sefer Torah the story of Amalek. So why is that not sufficient? Why is it a dilemma at all? Just go to shul on the morning of Purim and you'll hear both. So this is a technical discussion. It's not really relevant to our shir right now, but the point being that as much as we know that the Megillah is so central, is so important for our focus on Purim, the Tumas Hadeshen reminds us that Parshas Zachor might be even more important. And this mitzvah of Timcha Zecher Amalek is so critical, and it must always remain at the forefront of our minds. So much so that the Mechilta, which is the Medrash in Parshas Beshalach, goes so far to the extreme, it's so excessive in the way it describes our obligation toward obliterating the memory of Amalek. Writes the Mechilta in Parshas Beshalach. We know that the pasuk says this is a Milchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midor dor. We know that this is an ongoing fight from one generation to the next that will never end. And what does that mean, midor dor? I don't know any Jew today that is fighting off Amalek. We don't even know who Amalek is. How do we identify Amalek? Maybe Amalek has already been destroyed. Maybe Amalek has taken on a new form. So what does it mean? Milchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midor dor. This is a perpetual fight. This is a perpetual argument that just continues to go on and on. So the Medrash explains what it means is as follows. Rebbe Lezer Omer, this is number Gimel here on the sheet. Nishba HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God made a promise. Shem yavo echad mikol ha'umos v'hiskayer. If somebody will come from any nation of the world that want to convert, so the Medrash says, we accept them. A man, a woman, why not? We're willing to accept converts. Somebody wants to come and join our religion, not a problem. We are not an exclusive religion. However, the Medrash says, Me Amalek ubeso. What if somebody comes and he happens to be from the family of Amalek? Writes the Medrash, Lo yikabluhu. Absolutely not. We will not accept that person. It doesn't matter that you're 100 generations back to Amalek. We will never accept somebody who stems from the family of Amalek. And that, says the Medrash, is what it means. Milchama la Hashem ba'Amalek midor dar. This is not a one-time event. This is something that will go on forever, which seems so extreme. It seems so unreasonable and so excessive a response to our relationship with Amalek. And the truth is, if you think that this is almost an inordinate response and unreasonable to somebody who may have had a run-in with us, you are not alone. Because the Gemara Masechtas Yuma tells us that the great Shaul HaMelech felt the same way. Shaul HaMelech was given an instruction. And by the way, don't forget, Shaul HaMelech was referred to by the Navi as Bechir Hashem. He was the choice candidate chosen by none other than God himself. So he was given this divine appellation of Bechir Hashem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves him. The Ribono Shel Olam is totally infatuated with him. The Gemara says that Shaul HaMelech never did an Aveira in his life. Then Shana Shaul b'Malcho. The pasuk says Shaul HaMelech was 1 year old when he took over the mantle of leadership. And the Gemara asks, is it possible that Shaul HaMelech was accepted as the leader of the Jewish people when he was 1? Can't be. So what it means, says the Gemara, is he was Kiben Shana Lachet. It means that Shaul HaMelech was just like an innocent young child who does nothing wrong, who everybody loves. There can't be any claim against this person because life is just so innocent, so simple at that time. That was Shaul HaMelech as an adult. And yet Shaul HaMelech is given this instruction to eradicate the memory of Amalek. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him a message and says, don't think that you just need to fight off the army. It's every man, it's every woman, it's every child, it's every piece of property that they own, it's every cattle, all the animals, all the fields, everything. So Shaul HaMelech turns back in the Gemara Masechtas Yuma and he says to Shaul, Sha'amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Shaul. When God instructs Shaul HaMelech, Lech v'hikisa as Amalek, I'd like you to go and destroy Amalek. Omar Shaul HaMelech responds by saying, we are familiar that if somebody is killed out in the forest somewhere, we all need to take collective responsibility. How could we allow such a tragedy to happen? That's on one person, one homeless individual who we don't even know his name, don't know his identity, he doesn't have a family member to come claim him. We all need to take it seriously and we need to take responsibility for that. And yet, Shaul HaMelech says, you are telling me, when we're dealing with hundreds, thousands of property, of lives, of people, of families, of communities, you're telling me just to go and destroy everything? And even if you can figure out how to justify our murdering of people, which is very hard to justify, maybe they did something wrong, but Shaul HaMelech turns to the Ribono Shel Olam and he says, how can you blame the animals? What have they done wrong? Shaul HaMelech says, if the adults may have done something wrong and to that to hold them accountable, how do you explain your reaction to young children? What a horrific act. It's not us asking the question. It's Shaul HaMelech. It is Shaul HaMelech. Yatzis Abaskol v'Yamarlo. Abaskol, a heavenly voice, came out and said, Al tihi tzadik harba. Stop trying to be so righteous. I, God, have instructed you to do this, and that means it's the appropriate thing to do. Which means Shaul HaMelech didn't really get an answer. He didn't understand how to process this mitzvah. And the reason why he had difficulty is because this is something that requires a genuine explanation. It's because this is so antithetical to everything that Jewish life represents, to everything that we stand for in any other aspect of life. It doesn't seem to fit. Tell you the truth, a number of years ago, when Rav Asher Weiss's wife was very sick, so we spent a lot of time together because she was here in Manhattan in the hospital, and I used to go every day to spend time with him. She was in the ICU, and we had many conversations that we otherwise would never have had. Normally, he's learning and writing and doing and whatever he's involved with. But we had many conversations that we probably otherwise would never have had. And one of them was about, he shared with me some of his challenges in Hashkafa, some of the things that troubled him. And one of them was this. I asked him, how do we explain to high school kids, or for that matter, how do we explain to adults who struggle with the issue of Amalek? What do we do? He expanded on that and he said, think about it in practical terms. It's like, it's hard to wrap our heads around. There are some who believe that Amalek is not just one nation that happens to live in a certain community. It's possible that Amalek has now proliferated and is all over the world. So that means, if God forbid I ever had an open heart surgery, and I have a righteous, Gentile, amazingly sensitive, caring doctor or nurse who has taken care of me, and did the surgery not once, but twice, I had a few stents put in, and then I have all the follow-up for the 20 years after that. And one fine day, I get word that this doctor, who's become my closest friend, and the person who has saved my life numerous times, one fine day, I get a message from a Navi that he is a member of the family of Amalek. What do I do? The way he said it, what do I do if tomorrow morning the mailman who comes to deliver the mail to my house, and he's been delivering faithfully every day, an upstanding, wonderful citizen, never done a thing wrong to me or anybody else. What do I do if I find out that he's part of Amalek? So how do we deal with that? These aren't new questions. These are questions that Shaul HaMelech had trouble with. And I asked him, do I have your permission if a kid ever comes to me and says he has an issue with this? Do I have permission to say, you're in good company? Because there are Gedolei Yisrael who have the same problem that you have. He said, absolutely. I think you should tell them that. And he said, I think kids should know that sometimes we struggle to understand, again, in our culture, in our society, we struggle to understand how to appreciate a particular mitzvah. It doesn't mean that we write it off. It doesn't mean that we take it out of the mitzvah Torah. God's Torah is eternal, but sometimes we need to really work hard to try to figure out, what is this all about and what does it mean for us? And to just complicate matters even more and to maybe compound the problem, let's look at the Torah's perspective in general on bloodshed, on violence, on brutality, and let's try to understand whether or not this mitzvah of Lachias Amalek fits in not to our way of thinking, but does it even fit in with the way the Torah generally instructs us to think? And I'd argue absolutely not. This seems to be an anomaly. Something is very unusual about this mitzvah. So let's build up the case as follows. There's a medrash in the Koheles Rabbah, where the medrash tells us, B'shal Shabarach HaKadosh Baruch Hu es Adam HaRishon. When God created Adam HaRishon, he put him out into a beautiful world. The Ribbon Shalom opened his eyes and he said, look at Gan Eden. Look how beautiful this world is. Re'ei Masai, I want you to see how exquisite this world is. Look how appealing it is. Look how magnificent, look how complicated and how calculated this world is. And I want you to know, Adam HaRishon, all of this, all of the plants, all of the animal kingdom, all the beauty that you see in this world is for you. It's in order that human beings should appreciate and love the world that they inhabit. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, be mindful. Do not destroy my world. Don't go around sabotaging what I have worked so hard to build and create. Because if you destroy it, it's destroyed forever. You go over to a tree and you pull off a leaf for no good reason, it's gone forever. You kill an animal just because you're in the mood, just because you have nothing else to do. Understand the consequence of that action. HaKadosh Baruch Hu warns Adam HaRishon and says, understand that you have been put here to enjoy. I have made all of this for you to appreciate. And if you destroy it, it's destroyed forever. There are times in halacha when we find that we are instructed to be proactive and to do something that seems violent. For example, the Gemara Masechtas Brachos, it's also a Gemara Masechtas Sanhedrin, says, what happens if, God forbid, somebody is threatening or endangering my life, and I'm afraid for good reason? So the Gemara says, Habala hargatha, hashkein lahargo. Don't just sit down and be passive. Don't let the person take your life. If somebody comes and threatens your life, you need to be proactive and make sure to save and defend yourself. Hashkein lahargo. You have the right to go and kill that person first. Of course, it makes sense. And yet, the Gemara says, what if there's a person who is in that unfortunate reality and that unfortunate situation? Somebody comes and threatens their life, and yet the Gemara says, if for whatever reason I would have a gun, which I do not, and I have the ability either to kill that person or to hurt them in a way that they will now be neutralized, and there's no longer a current danger to me, and I make that decision to kill the person instead of hurting them. Now let's remember, my life was in jeopardy. My life was being threatened. I have to make a calculated decision exactly what I'm going to do in response. Again, I'm supposed to save myself. But the Gemara says, what if I really had the ability to save myself by just hurting the other person? Instead, I decided to kill her. The Gemara says, in such a case, neharagala. I am held responsible, and the Beis Din will take my life for what I've done. Which means even when the Torah gives us permission to defend ourselves and to do what needs to be done to protect ourselves, there's a way in which we are allowed to do so, and not 1 ounce more. We don't just have license to go wild. It's not the way we think, it's not the way we behave, it's not the way we respond. There are, in fact, rare times when the Beis Din has to administer capital punishment. But when describing that, the Mishnah writes that if you have a Sanhedrin, if you have a group of people who are the Beis Din, and they end up killing somebody once every 7 years, so the Mishnah brands them as chovlanis. They are a destructive and hostile group of people. What do you mean? You have hundreds of thousands of Jews. I'm sure somebody does things wrong, and every once in a while, somebody deserves capital punishment. Says the Mishnah, no. Although it's true that we have guidelines of when somebody is supposed to lose their life, if a Sanhedrin, if a Beis Din applies those kinds of rules too often, meaning once every 7 years, we brand them as a group of chavlanim, a group of destructive people. One opinion in the Mishnah is not once every 7 years, but once every 70 years. Rabbi Akiva said, if I would have been on the Beis Din, lo nerak adam me'olam. Nobody ever would have been killed. It doesn't mean there would have been lawlessness. It just means I would have figured out other ways to get rid of them, take them off the streets. I would have imprisoned them, whatever it may have been, but nobody ever would have died. And that's in a case where they deserve to die. That's in a case where the Torah prescribes that kind of punishment for them. And yet Rabbi Akiva says it's just not the way a Jew thinks. It's not the way a Jew acts. It's not the way we behave. It's not what we do. There are a category of people who sin, who deserve to get malchus. And again, it's hard for us to understand in today's culture and today's society, what does it mean to take somebody and give them lashes in a public square? How do you understand that? It's like in that same conversation, Rav Asher Weiss said to me, you see a video from Saudi Arabia where they take a person, bring them into the public square and give them lashes in front of everybody. And you're repulsed, you're disgusted by it. And you ask yourself, is it that different than the way the Torah describes we are to punish somebody who does something wrong? So it's hard to understand this in today's culture. It's hard to understand it in the climate that we live in today, but yet there is such a concept that the Torah describes. And when giving us those instructions, it says that you hit the person, that you give them lashes 39 times. Make sure before you do so, says the Gemara, that you have a doctor there who's going to determine how much the person can handle. If they can't handle it, you need to stop immediately. And if the Shliach Bezdin, if the designated appointee of the Bezdin, who's supposed to administer all these punishments, dare hit the person one more time than they're supposed to, dare hit them one more time against the doctor's instructions, and because of that, the person loses their life, he's to be held accountable, he's responsible. Because that's not the Jewish way. So much so, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, let's read it together, Daf Nun Ches, Hamadbiya Yado al Chaveiro. We're not only talking about taking someone's life, we're talking about violence in general. It's just not a Jewish concept. It's not our way. Hamadbiya Yado al Chaveiro, the Torah here says, if I raise a hand to hit someone, even if ultimately I don't end up hitting them, they run away or I change my mind, but already, even if nothing ends up happening, Nikra Russia. I'm already branded as an evil person just for the thought of hitting someone. It's just not the Jewish way. The Rambam expands this concept and he says, I'm not allowed to injure or wound myself, ben ba'atzmo, ben b'chavero, whether I'm hurting myself or hurting somebody else. And the Rambam says we have to be so careful about this. Because if a Beis Din is told to be mindful and to be careful about the person who's evil, who deserves to be hit, and yet we are held accountable if we hit them one more time, says the Rambam, can you imagine an innocent person who gets hit just because I'm enraged, just because I'm upset? Shulchan Aruch quotes this as well, and writes that we need to take it seriously. And the Ramah adds something fascinating. You know, we have many people who violate all kinds of averos. All of us do. So there's a scale of what we violate. It's like the Bali Machshava say, everybody has an akuda sapachira. So I'm not challenged whether or not I should keep Shabbos this week. I've gotten past that. But there are many high school kids that we know who are holding there, who are not sure. Should I use my cell phone this Shabbos or not? But nobody's watching. We shouldn't judge them. That's Nakuda Sabachira. Everybody's holding a different place in life. And that's the way it is. And we all have struggles and we all have challenges in our own way. And yet, with all of the things that we do wrong collectively, it's very rare that we put someone in chayrim for something that they've done wrong. Chayrim means we give them a curse. And we say, like the Gemara explains, chayrim is the same letters as Ramach. Right? Chayrim, Ches, Reish, Mem. The same as Ramach, which is the number of limbs that we have in our body. And the intention when we give someone a chayrim is, we curse their Ramach Evarim. We say all 248 limbs in your body should fall apart and you should be destroyed because you're so horrible. A chayrim means when we excommunicate a person. Very rare. We have people who are openly, brazenly Mechalelei Shabbos. Shabbos is one of the most important mitzvahs, one of the Aseres HaDibros. We don't put them in chayrim. Many things that people do wrong don't end them up in chayrim. And yet the Ramah says here in Choshen Mishpat, somebody who dare lay a hand on another person is put in a communal chayrim. Is put in a communal chayrim. So much so, the Chasam Sofer in the 1800s, a riveting tshuva, absolutely riveting, where he describes a community. I forgot to put it on here, but listen to what he says. Al dvar ish ra ma'alalim, there was a wild, violent person, asher hika be'egra of Russia, that he went ahead and he punched somebody else or he hit someone, ad shvoch dam, and the person bled as a result. of what the other individual had done to him. And he says, we live in a community where, people were upset, but nobody really did anything. What are we supposed to do? I'm not a policeman. I don't know how to enforce the law. What should I do? And he says, happens to be that this individual was an Avel al Aviv al Imo. He happened to be in Avelis for his father or mother. And generally the practice is that for the 12 months following the death of the parent, the child says Kaddish, and the child daves for the Amalek. And they sent the Shaila to the Chassan Sofer. We as a community who hear this man say Kaddish in Shul tomorrow, are we allowed to answer Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah to his Kaddish? Maybe he's such a horrible person, and after all, the Ramah says somebody who hits another individual is worthy of being put into Chayren, which means you're excommunicated, you're out. If you're out, that means you don't count for the minyan. That means you don't belong here. It means maybe we shouldn't listen when you daven for the Amalek, and we shouldn't respond to your Kaddish. That was the Shaila they asked the Chassan Sofer. Can you imagine? Once we're on this topic, I just figured it was worth mentioning as well. An amazing tshuva in the Maharami Rittenberg. Maharami Rittenberg was one of the great Chachmei Ashkenaz. He lived at the time, the end of the Tkufa of the Balei Atosis in the 1200s. The Maharami Rittenberg has an amazing tshuva about a husband who treats his wife disrespectfully. I know I should give this year to the opposite gender, but keep it in mind. It's an interesting chalila. I shouldn't joke. Should never know from such a tshuva. But the Maharami Rittenberg, I bring this just to emphasize the point. Maharami Rittenberg writes, came to his attention, it was a husband who was disrespectful to his wife. Can you imagine? And not just disrespectful to his wife, he actually hit his wife. So the Maharami Rittenberg discusses this. And if you think this is just a tshuva that's buried away somewhere in the Maharami Rittenberg, who I'm sure none of you have ever looked in his sefer before, nor will you in the future, you should know that this psak of the Maharami Rittenberg is quoted lahalacha in the Ramah, in Shulchan Aruch. So it's not lost somewhere in the halachic literature. It's taken very seriously. Maharami Rittenberg writes, Nira li, kol ben bris chayiv l'chabed es ishto yoser migupo. Every Jewish man has an obligation to respect his wife more than he looks after himself. As the Gemara says, Ola imo ve'ena yoredas imo. The Gemara has an amazing concept, which is, what if a woman comes from a wealthy family and the man comes from a very simple family? So she's used to a standard of living that was whatever it was, and he's used to a standard of living that is far less than hers. Now they get married, and the question is, well, whose standard of living are we going to adopt? What are we going to do? So the Gemara says the bottom line is, the woman always has the upper hand in either direction. Ola imo ve'ena yoredas imo. A woman is never to be lowered from her standard of living that she was accustomed to. And the husband has an obligation to provide for that woman's needs. Even if he grew up in a home where that wasn't the norm, where that wasn't what they did. But that's what the Gemara says, that's the standard. And it goes in the other direction as well. If a husband grew up in a home where he had a very high standard, when they got engaged, the woman assumed that she was going to be elevated to that way of living. That's what she deserves, that's what she gets. That's what a husband has an obligation to provide her with. And he explains here that l'chaim mitna v'lo l'tzar. Marriage was instituted to give life, not to give people pain. And in the Ksuba it says, a husband takes upon himself that he is going to take responsibility for all of his wife's needs. The hamake es ishto. Forget about being disrespectful. Writes the Maharami Rittenberg, a man who dared hit his wife. Mikubalani, he says, the tradition is in our community. Sheyesh yoser lahachmer bo mimake es haveru. We are going to be more serious about our response to such a person than we would be to two individuals who got in a fight. This is far worse. I don't have an obligation to give respect and honor to every individual in the world. I'm supposed to be nice to them. I don't have to show them great kavod. But for a spouse, for a wife, the Gemara says that a husband has an obligation to show not just decency, but respect. And therefore he says, a man who dares hit his wife, derech hagoyim bekach, he says this is a profane act. It shows how indecent you are. Chalila b'chalila l'shum ben bris me'asos hazos. How dare any Jewish man ever do such a thing? V'ha'oseh. And should we find out that a man ever does? Yesh lahachrimo ulenadoso ulahalkoso uliansho b'chol minei ridui. We take communal responsibility and we kick this person out of town and we put them in cherem and we say you don't belong to be a part of anything we do because this is something that is so antithetical to what we believe in, to what we stand for. And this is quoted in the Ramah Halacha. It's quoted in the Ramah Halacha as well. David Amalek, his entire life, dreamed and he was yearning and languishing to be the one to build the Beis Hamikdash. And he goes and he buys the property and he talks about it with the Navi, and this is what he wants. And then he gets the devastating response that, I know this is what you want, but unfortunately we have rejected your request. We have denied your request. And David Amalek asks, what have I done wrong? Why am I not worthy of building the Beis Hamikdash? I'm Melech Yisrael. I wrote all of Tehillim. Look at the life that I lived. Look what I've done for you. And yet the pasuk says in Divrei Hayamim, "Vayhi Elai Devar Hashem Neimar." Baruch Hu appears to David Amalek and he says, "I'm sorry. I would have loved for you to build the Beis Hamikdash, but dam lerov shafachta. You have blood on your hands, David Amalek. You're a warrior. You're a general of an army. You can't be the one to build the Beis Hamikdash." Now David Amalek had every right to respond, "Excuse me. I fought for noble causes. Actually, God, I fought for causes that were so honorable, it was always for you. I did it because you told me that we need to conquer Eretz Israel. I did it because you told me I have to lead the Jewish people. And sometimes being a leader of the Jewish people means you have to go out into battle. And I led them with dignity and with honor and with glory. And now I'm being punished for it." But David Amalek understands. There are some people who sometimes have to be engaged in those activities. And the Torah prescribes exactly how and when to do it. But our Beis Hamikdash, which is the icon of the Jewish people, cannot be built on those foundations because that's not who we are. It's not what we stand for. So much so that in the end of Parshas Yisro, I'm sorry that this is like a 45-minute introduction to a point. But the Gemara says, the Psukim say in Parshas Yisro, when constructing a Mizbeach, we're told, Lo sivne eshen gazis. You're not allowed to make a Mizbeach made from metal materials. No metal can be used. Why? Because metal reminds us of swords. So the pasuk doesn't say you're not allowed to use a sword to build a Mizbeach. Now, of course not. But you're not even allowed to build a Mizbeach with anything that gives us a reminder of a sword. Because that's how antithetical this is to what our nation stands for. So if I have not yet belabored the point or overstated it enough, I think the question needs to be answered. What is with our unreasonable, exaggerated, extreme reaction to Amalek? Why do we say Milchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midor dor? This is something we will continue to fight for and against. Why is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says we need to always remember, like the Rambam told us the way we started, that sinah, that vile hatred needs to always be a part of us, a part of our identity. What is it about Amalek that we need to hate so much? What is it that we need to eradicate from our world? So to try and unpack, to try and understand this, let me just frame it in the following context. In the beginning of Parshas Miketz, we read the famous story of Paro and his dreams. And in describing that very unusual story, the Torah tells us, Vayikatz Paro, Paro wakes up, he has a startling dream, and he sees stalks of wheat, and he sees the animals, and he sees all kinds of strange visions. And what are the next words in the pasuk? Vayikatz Paro, he gets up. Vayishan, and he goes back to sleep. Vayachalom shenis. Paro has a tremendous revelation in his dream. God was clearly communicating something with him. God obviously wanted to send him an important message that he needed to hear, but what does he do? He rolls over and goes right back to sleep, which leads God to send him another message. You contrast that reaction, that response, with Yaakov Avinu. When he's running away, he's a fugitive from his brother. And as we're told, he falls asleep. Unbeknownst to him, he's sleeping in the holiest place in the world. And he also has this divine revelation, and he sees Malachi Elokim Olam Yordim. He has a Sulam Muksav Artzav Arosha Magia Shamayma. Yaakov Avinu sees this ladder, and he sees angels going up and going down. And what does he do? Vayikatz Yaakov Mishnaso. Yaakov Avinu immediately wakes up and understands what's happening. Vayomer, and he says, Achen yesh Hashem b'makom hazeh v'anochi lo yadati. Immediately upon having that revelation, Yaakov Avinu wakes up and he recognizes the unique experience of the moment. Yaakov Avinu responds because he understands that you can't simply ignore these moments of life. You can't just walk away and not realize. And throughout life, we are all given the opportunity to make those choices. We encounter all kinds of people, all kinds of individuals. God sends us messages all the time. Sometimes they're more subtle and more delicate and indirect. And at other times in our lives, they are so obvious and absolute that you can't deny it. It's so clear. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects all of us to make that choice, which is, are we going to react? Are we going to respond like Paro? We see something, we feel something, we understand there's a major event going on in our lives, we're in the world, and we just roll over and go back to sleep? Or do we respond like Yaakov Avinu? Vayikatz Yaakov Mishnaso, and he realizes, he's startled. He understands it's time to be a little bit more mindful. It's time to be a little bit more thoughtful and internalize what it is that I saw. Internalize what it is that I'm experiencing. When Klal Yisrael, when the Jewish people came out from the land of Mitzrayim, this was after an entire year of machos, an overwhelming sense of pride that they had. And finally, they come to the climax, to the culmination by Kriyas Yamsuf. And the Gemara tells us, the Medrash says, the revelation that the simplest person had on the occasion of Kriyas Yamsuf was greater, was more profound than any of the visions that Yechezkel had in his Nebuah. That's what was happening at the time. Everybody understood with clarity that God is communicating with us. And it wasn't just the Jewish people. The Psukim tell us, we say it in Hallel, every month when we say Hallel. Hayom Rav Ayanos, Hayarden Yisov Le'achar, Heharim Raktu Chayim, the entire world shook. Milifnei Adon Chulei Aretz, Milifnei Elohai Yaakov. The entire world understood that this was a moment of profound and divine inspiration. Everybody understood what was happening. We say it every day in our davening in Oz Yashir. The world came to a standstill. People were in awe. People were trembling. They were in admiration of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There was a wonderment. Nobody could understand how this happened. But everybody knew that God was communicating with them. Along comes Amalek. Asher karcha bader. It's not that we haven't fought wars before. It's not that we haven't had adversaries. But Amalek comes, baderach b'tzeis chami Mitzrayim. right after you finish this monumental experience, this moment that the entire world recognized, along comes Amalek and denies the gravity and the significance of that moment. Amalek comes and says, it's just trivial. It's just another day. Well, sometimes water, based on the forces of gravity, will move in a different direction. And every so often, a well will dry up. So every so often, a river, a sea, an ocean can also dry up. And they disregarded that message and they depreciated everything that Kriyas Yamsuf was about. You have an entire world that's watching with awe, that's watching with wonderment. And along come Amalek and say, don't pay attention, just ignore it, move on with life. Be like Paro. Have a dream, communicate with God, but just turn over and move on because life needs to be lived. When the Torah describes the story of Amalek, we're told, Asher Karcha Badera. Mefarshim say Asher Karcha means everything's derech mikra. We'll do an investigation. We'll send all the experts out. We'll figure out why it is that this happened. And we'll move on because we'll have an explanation. We'll have a calculated interpretation as to what exactly happened. We're so smart. We're so brilliant. We got it all figured out. Asher Karcha Badera. The problem with Amalek is not they fought against us. The problem is they brought this mindset, this attitude to the world that it's possible to see something and to experience something in our lives as monumental, as life-altering as Kriyas Yamsuf, and to say and to make people believe that it's completely to be disregarded, that it is inconsequential, that nothing really happened. It's just derech mikra. No reason to pay attention. Haman, when he experiences the whole miraculous turn of events, when Achashverosh turns to Haman and he says, I'd like you to take Mordechai, put him onto the horse, travel through the streets. I mean, this is the most implausible outcome that anyone could have ever imagined. It was an impossibility. It never even came onto the realm of possibility at all. And Haman goes home, and he comes home for dinner that night, and his wife says, how was your day? Well, something happened today. Well, tell me, what was it? Vayisaper Haman lezeres ishto. Sukkim tell us that Haman turns to his wife, and he has a conversation with her, and he tells her, Eis asher harahu. That same word. Asher karcha badera. He tells his wife, yeah, something happened. No big deal. Happens to be Achashverosh changed his mind. Yesterday he thought this way, today he thinks that way. So I have to do some things today. No big deal, just another day in the office. He made himself blind to the reality that was in front of his eyes, that was so clear, that was so obvious. But he chose not to believe it. He chose not to respond. And the way that he reports it over to his wife is Eis asher karo. Yeah, let me tell you what happened today. No big deal. Inconsequential. No reason to be in awe. No reason to be shocked or frazzled by anything. Just another day. Life must go on. The world would continue to be the world that we live in. And the Malbim, when he describes what is it about Amalek that makes us so uncomfortable, and he says it's not the people, it's the attitude. Writes the Malbim in the bottom of the page, Hasiva ha'atzmis l'malchama zu haisa. Why did Amalek come and attack the Jewish people? And the Malbim says sometimes nations attack to show how powerful they are, and sometimes it's because you're encroaching on their land, and other times it's because you're in their way and you incited them. None of those were the reason why Amalek came. None of those were appropriate. In this circumstance, says the Malbim, the reason why was mitzad ha'kira be'elokim. They wanted everybody to understand that we don't believe in God. We don't believe that things happen because there's a divine being in the world that wants them to happen. When the entire world was shaken, when every single leader of the free world at the time was terrified because of what was happening. Every Jew and non-Jew alike had no choice but to believe in God at that moment. Amalek comes along and says, nothing to be startled about. Nothing happened. Just ignore it and move on. And as much as I think it's a beautiful takeaway from Parshas Amalek, I can't stop but to think about how relevant it is in our world today. We are 1 year into this pandemic. Anybody remember? Last Purim, we were scrambling. I cannot believe, I was crying this week. I cannot believe we are discussing the same questions that we discussed last year. And everybody said it's just going to be Pesach, by Shavuos will be okay. And by Shavuos, we said by the summertime will be okay, and the camps are going to open, and everyone's going to be fine. And then we realized that that wasn't to be. So for sure, Yom Run is going to be fine. And then certainly Sukkot. And we went through an entire cycle of events in the Jewish calendar. And here we are again. Here we are again, still facing a crippling, a paralyzing, debilitating pandemic that has destroyed so many people's lives, not just the lives that have been lost, but it has smothered and suffocated so many lives, both literally and so much more beyond that. People's parnasa, people's homes, people's family, their shalom bayis, children going crazy at their parents, parents can't handle their kids anymore. Families, I tell you, I hear they can't even have family chats anymore because they're so busy fighting with each other about you're going to follow this protocol and that one. Don't come to my house, and I don't want you visiting, and you shouldn't get near me. It's tragic. It's awful. All of this are the unintended consequences, so to speak, of a pandemic. We're focusing on how many hospitalizations and how many people are dying, and all of that is horrible, and I get it, but think about the whole picture. Understand how debilitating this is. And it's so clear to me, for a year already, that God is communicating, God is talking to all of us. He brought the entire world to its knees, like we say every day in Aleinu. There's a time in history that God says the entire world will come crumbling down on its knees and stand in awe in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That time is right now, if you haven't noticed. The entire world economy, every powerful country in this world that we know of, has been brought to its feet. We're locked out of countries that we used to freely visit. We had so many freedoms which have been stripped away from us. And what do? We got it all worked out. Asher Karcha Lader. We're going to send the scientists, and the World Health Organization is going to send a team of, all the analytics and all the statisticians down to Wuhan, and we're going to locate exactly how this started and exactly why it happened and who's responsible and who's not. And after we do that investigation, we examine exactly what went wrong, and we do a complete analysis of all the facts. Then we will hold those people accountable. They will be responsible. And after we hold them culpable for whatever happened, life will move on. And we will remain the same. That is Amalek. Asher Karcha Badera. You can watch Kriyas Yamsuf. You can watch God doing his magic. You can be overwhelmed by it. You can be crippled. Your entire life can change and brought to a screeching halt, and yet we're going to do an investigation, figure it out. Now we have a vaccine. Life is going to go back to normal. We'll be fine. And all of us will just go back to being ourselves. And has God ever screamed louder at us in our lifetimes than now? How much more powerful can the word of God be than it is now? And yet, nobody's listening. Paro has a dream, and you ask yourself, goes back to sleep, is he insane? Think about the story of Bilam. You ever had an animal communicating with a person, talking to that person? And what does Bilam do? Talks back to the animal. He has a conversation like it's normal. And you ask yourself, is he nuts? Is he insane? He doesn't realize that there's something bigger going on here. God is talking to him, obviously. When was the last time a donkey ever communicated with a person and spoke their language? He just moves on. Every year when we read that story, I ask myself, how can you be so insane? Then I realize, I'm the same way. God has all kinds of ways of communicating with us. So it doesn't have to be that an animal speaks to us, but he has so many other ways. And we act like Bilam, and we act like Paro. Asher Karcha Badera. Just laugh the whole thing off. Not laugh, but explain away. We'll explain it scientifically, explain everything, make everyone believe. No big deal, nothing to get frazzled about. Everyone take it easy. We'll have it under control. Leaders of all countries are telling their constituency everything will be fine. Over time, everyone will be vaccinated. We'll get back to normal. You'll be back in your businesses. Life will move on. And life probably will move on. Nothing's going to change. That is Timcha as Zachor Amalek. Don't get rid of the people. God will figure out how to get rid of them. Get rid of that attitude and that mindset of Amalek that is willing to watch a Kriyas Yamsuf and convince others around them that it's just an insignificant experience in the world history. No big deal. Let life move on. A number of years ago, I read an article in the Washington Post. Feels like a lifetime ago, 2016. And it's something that I thought about a lot over the last couple of months. So I'm just going to take a few snippets from that article. And they write, from climate change to the anti-vaccine movement, the question that they raise is denial on the rise in America? In January of this year, an esteemed astrophysicist and a chart-topping rapper went head-to-head in a public debate about the curvature of the Earth. I mean, how insane is this? A person who spent their entire life studying physics and understands the ins and outs of this issue has to lower himself to go on a public stage with a rapper who knows nothing about the most basic elementary rules of science. But that's the world we live in. They have to go into a public debate about the curvature of the Earth. We're a scientifically advanced society. Computers in our pockets can do nearly anything we ask them. Soon enough, cars will be driving themselves, as we know since 2016 they are. But there remains a significant population that does not accept what scientists tell us to do. And they ask, what is going on? The answer lies in a deep-seated psychological response that helps us manage information that makes us uncomfortable. Denial is the deliberate, often psychologically motivated neglect of information that would be too upsetting or anxiety-provoking to allow into one's own belief system. Naomi Orkesas, who is a professor of history and scientific studies at the University of California, said in her keynote address, I'm here with a very depressing conclusion, and that is that knowledge is not power. If people don't like the implications of your knowledge, they will resist, they will reject, and they will attack you. Knowledge alone does not yield appropriate action. We get the idea that if we just tell people what we know, they'll change the way they think and what they do, but that's not the case. You can see something, it can be so abundantly clear to you, but we have this reflex of denialism. It's the natural reaction and response. Now you'll say, maybe it's just people who think that way. Maybe it's just the people who are so small-minded and silly. Maybe it's just the people who are unaware and oblivious to what's going on in the world, who don't understand the gravity of the moment. Let me give you a great example. Yes, it sounds like a bizarre and irrational phenomenon to act and behave this way. But I'll give you an example from somebody who otherwise was a prudent and thoughtful, considerate human being, and yet had the same natural instinct that they could not put the events in front of them and internalize what they mean in my own life. David Amalek, the Navi tells us in Sefer Shmuel, I see it's 10:31. Sorry, I'm just going to finish up, almost. So David Amalek, an amazingly complicated story there. David Amalek, for whatever reason, gets his eyes on a woman, Bathsheba, and he decides he wants to marry her. Now, that would be highly inappropriate because David Amalek was married, and also Bathsheba was married. So how's he going to get this woman of his dreams? Not going to work out. So David Amalek comes up with a great idea. David Amalek goes and instructs the commander of his army. And he tells him, I'd like you to send the husband of Bathsheba out to war. And don't just let him be a foot soldier like everybody else. Put him on the front lines. This way, if anybody's going to be killed, it'll be him. And then, if the plan works, David is thinking in the back of his mind that he's going to end up having this woman who's now available. Perfect. Now, it sounds completely insane. How sick can you be to come up with such a plan? The Gemara says you have to give all kinds of interpretations to explain how David Amalek did this. I don't know. At face value, whatever those are, it's for another time. You read the Psukim and you see something went terribly wrong here. David Amalek's mind went wild. He came up with this crazy plan, and he decided this is what we're going to do. And he does it. Nasan HaNavi is the prophet at the time. And he is charged with breaking the good news to David Amalek that what just happened is unacceptable. So what does he do? He goes to David Amalek and he says, I'd like to tell you a story. David says, sure. So he engages him in a story and he tells him about this wealthy man who has a inn. And the man has everything one can ever ask for in life. And next door to him, he has a very poor neighbor. And the poor neighbor has nothing more than just one sheep. And at night, he sits and he cuddles with the sheep. And he takes walks with the sheep every day. And that's all he has. That's his nachas. That's his everything. It's his parnasa. Nothing. He has nothing else. One fine day, the wealthy man has a visitor that comes into the inn. And part of the deal was you need to serve the company. Not only do you need to provide them with a bed to sleep in and some heat, but you also need to serve them some food. So the wealthy man invites him in. He says, please take a room, sit down, I'm going to prepare you a meal. He goes to the next door neighbor's backyard. He steals a sheep, he slaughters it, he prepares it, and he serves it for dinner to this guest that he has. Nasan HaNavi turns to David Amalek and he says, how would you react to such a story? What do you think? How should we punish the wealthy man? What an evil, insensitive thing to do. And David Amalek says, Ben Mamesh Ha'ish Hazeh, we should kill him. How do you destroy somebody's life like that? You have everything in the world, life's going great for you, you have to destroy somebody else's life? The only thing he had going for him is the sheep. He took it away from him. To which Nasan HaNavi turns back to David and he says, Atah Ha'ish. You are that man. How can you not understand that that is exactly what you just did? You are the Melech Yisrael. You have everything in the world, and you got to go after this poor man and his wife. That's what you do? And David Amalek is shocked. But the answer is to look at life events and turn and look at ourselves in the mirror and say, Atah Ha'ish, it's actually me. This experience is supposed to impact my life because it's me who is experiencing it. That's a very painful and difficult task. It's much easier to just look at it in the abstract in theory and let life move on. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he describes what the life of the Jew is supposed to look like, the Ribbon Shalom says we have a two-pronged approach, and that is, it's not good enough to be informed of the mitzvahs HaTorah. It's not good enough to know what we are supposed to do or not do. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us in Parshas Nitzaveh, V'yadata hayom. Yes, you need to make sure that you educate yourself. If we're not going to be educated, we cannot perform the kind of mitzvahs that God wants us to do. We need to know Hilchos Shabbos well. Yes, we need to know Hilchos Kashrus well. We need to know everything well. That's V'yadata hayom, but that's insufficient. V'hashevosa el levavecha. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, we need to take it a step further. We need to internalize the messages of all that we know. We need to do something in our lives that makes us understand, like David Amalek was made to understand, Atah Ha'ish, you are that person. Everything you see now is actually happening to you in real life. And the question is, how are you going to respond? How are you going to react? We are all given that choice to respond like Paro did. We have these revelations. We have these understandings. We look at it, we stare it in the face, we know it well, and we roll over and go back to sleep. Or we're given the opportunity to respond and to react like Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu, who is startled, who wakes up, who reimagines the life that he's living, who understands that there's something bigger happening here, who understands that life is not just a shared karfa baderech. Life is not just things happen. Life goes on and everything's scientific and everything's with a calculation and it's all going to work out. It doesn't always work that way. And there are moments in our lives when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to turn around and say, not just be aware of what's happening, but internalize what it means, understand and react and respond appropriately, because there's something bigger that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to communicate to all of us. So let us hope, as we read the complicated Parshas of Amalek this week, that we not only fulfill and perform our mitzvah in a technical way, but it also gives us an opportunity to think about the messages behind this mitzvah of eradicating Amalek. It gives us an opportunity to think about how that translates into the Amalek inside of ourselves and what it means for us in our generation. Timcha es Zachor Amalek, Melchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midar dar. I wish everyone a wonderful day, and Amir Hashem, we will continue next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.